George Mason was a colonial statesman in the late 1700s, before and after the American Revolution. He was a co-author of the United States Bill of Rights and wrote the Declaration of Rights for Virginia. He was a highly respected lawman and statesman throughout the time period, and in 1775, George Washington called on him to write the Potomac River Bill. In his response to George Washington's call, he wrote, "Dear Sir, I have at last finished the Potomac River Bill, which I now send to you, together with some very long remarks thereon, and a letter to Mr. Johnson, in which you'll be pleased to put a wafer, when you forward the other papers to him. I also return the Acts of Assembly and Mr. Johnson's notes, which you sent me. This affair has taken me 5 times as long as I expected, and I do assure you I never engaged in anything which puzzled me more. There were such a number of contingencies to provide for, and drawing up laws a thing so much out of my way. I shall be well pleased if the pains I have bestowed upon the subject prove of any service to so great an undertaking, but by what I can understand, there will be so strong an opposition for Baltimore and the head of the bay as will go near to prevent its passage through the Maryland Assembly in any shape it can be offered." Basically, what George Mason is saying is that he wrote the Potomac River Bill, a bill which allowed for the sharing of the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. This bill gave each colony at this point, because it's 1775, gave each colony the rights to use the river. In the original charters, England and the Kings of England gave Virginia the right to use the Potomac River, and then a later king gave Maryland the right to use the river, claiming that each one state owned it, not both of them were sharing it. Basically, what this Potomac River Bill would do is destroy the controversy created by this river and create a mutually beneficial compromise for both colonies. Being that it's 1775, the colonies were planning to go to war with England in just under a year. So Mason was very confused in why the two colonies would be on such aggressive terms with each other when there's a common enemy that they could be fighting and arguing with. In a separate letter, Mason wrote, "What matter is it whether the majority of the subscribers are Maryland or Virginians, if their property is upon an equal footing and the work is of the general advantage of both provinces?" It's 1775, and so the colonies are preparing to go to war. Boston is creating an armory at Concord, and in this later passage, he brings up that North Carolina is creating an armory. "I suppose you have heard of the late purchase made by some North Carolina gentlemen from the Cherokee Indians of all the country between the Great Kanawha and the Tennessee rivers. I think, considering this colony has just expended about $100,000 upon the defense of the country, that it is pretty bold strike of the gentlemen. It is suspected some of our Virginia gentlemen are privately concerned in it." Virginia gentlemen are privately concerned by it. This is because the colonies are preparing for war. As it said, $100,000 had been spent by the state of North Carolina for defense of the country. That means $100,000 went to weapons, $100,000 went to men, $100,000 went to cannons. All of that money now needs to cover more territory because of these North Carolina gentlemen purchasing lands from the Cherokee. As the letter continues, he says, "I have always expected that the newfangled doctrine lately broached of the crown's title beyond the Allegheny Mountains till after the purchase of Fort Stanwix would produce 1,000 other absurdities and squabbles. However, if I am not mistaken, the crown, at that treaty, purchased of the 6 nations all the land as low as the Tennessee River. So now I suppose we must have a formal trial whether the 6 nations or the Cherokees had the legal right. But whether this is to be done ejectment, rid of iniquity, rid of partition, or what other processes, let those who invented this curious distinction determine. The intention of our assembly to so grant an object as the right of the colony to the western lands is inexcusable, and the confusion it will produce endless." This is saying that the confusion is endless because the original charters stated that the colonies had all lands to the west. Maryland believed it had every piece of land in this narrow strip going from the East Coast to the West Coast. And this was a huge deal when they were passing the Articles of Confederation, because Maryland didn't want to give up this land for the creation of new Western states. A lot of other states and colonies didn't want to either, such as Virginia. And the Crown, in the Proclamation Line of 1763, told them, it's not your land, it's the Native American land, and you don't get it, so get over it. And this angered a lot of people, but now what these North Carolina gentlemen are doing is buying this land and they're planning on settling it. This is completely going against that proclamation line. The third paragraph, or section of the letter, is one of the most important parts. It talks about the collection of taxes, the purchasing of instruments of death, which are weapons, of course, and it talks about a convention at Richmond. Allow me to read it. If I knew you were set off for the convention at Richmond, I would trouble you with 2 or 3 Virginia currency bills to make my second payment to Mr. Mosey, as I may not perhaps have this opportunity of sending it in April. We make it a poor hand of collecting, very few pay, though everyone promises, except Mr. Hartshorn of Alexandria, who flatly refuses. His conscience, I suppose, would not suffer him to be concerned in paying for instruments of death. George has been very unwell for some past days. As soon as he gets well, he intends to go up into the forest, where he has not yet been. What this is saying is that, to start off, there's a convention at Richmond. Now, the only possible reason for a convention at Richmond is to remember that there is the the Second Continental Congress meeting coming up. So, with that in place, Virginia needs to pick who its delegates are going to be. Obviously, Washington's going to be one of them because we know that Washington attended. But we don't know who else is going. And so that convention at Richmond is going to be deciding who's going to the Second Continental Congress to declare war at the Declaration of Independence, all that jazz. The next section, he says, we make a poor hand of collecting and very few pay, though everyone promises. One thing that is thematic through American history is that people don't like paying taxes. It just nobody likes it. There's the Tea Party today that says, we're going to drop taxes. It's not going to happen. You have to pay taxes. The excise tax put in place by Washington after the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention as he was first president, people didn't like paying that, and the Western Pennsylvania farmers rebelled, and they didn't want to pay that tax. People got mad at the English Crown when they changed from the Navigation Acts to the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, all those acts, because those were no longer acts on imports and exports. They were acts directly affecting the people. And so what he's saying is that we're trying to collect money to fight this war and to start preparing for buying weapons and paying soldiers, and nobody wants to pay. And this is a big problem because how are you supposed to fight a war when you don't have money? Robert Morris, he basically funded the entire war because nobody would pay. He asked for $12 million. He barely got $1 million. So that was a big problem throughout American history. And George Washington and George Mason are facing the same problem. Because if they're going to declare war, how are they going to fight a war when they have no money? And then he talks about Mr. Hartshorn of Alexandria. He flatly refuses because what George Mason says is his conscience would not suffer him to be concerned with paying for instruments of death. What could those instruments of death be? Weapons. What else would they be? He doesn't want to pay for these weapons because he doesn't want to get involved in a war. Probably a loyalist, so, I mean, it's obvious he doesn't want to break away from the Crown of England. Then it brings up about he intends to go up to the forest. Now, I'm not really sure about this, but from what I've done in research, the forest could be like a code for the armory, because North Carolina was making an armory, Massachusetts had an armory at Concord, and obviously the other states are going to start making armories if they're going to fight the British. So the forest could be where they're keeping the armory, and they're going to send Mr. Hartshorn up there and say, this is what we have so far, we need you to start paying so we can keep getting these weapons and keep getting these men and be successful in this war. Mason closes the letter with the family here join in their compliments to Miss Washington and the family at Mount Vernon. With dear sir, your affect, humble servant, George Mason.